Seb, jumping straight in. Great to see you again, man.
Oh man, it has been way too long. Yeah, I think 2024 is going to be an interesting year. Looking forward to catching up in person.
We're going to see you in Madeira.
Oh yeah, yeah. I have a feeling that Madeira is going to be an incredible conference. I think it's just got such incredible characters, and you've got Andre who's running it, and in such an unbelievable place.
It is an unbelievable place. Have you been?
I have never been.
All right. Yeah. No spoilers, but it is a paradise island. Subtropical paradise island. It's got a
Cannot
great
wait.
feel to it. It almost feels like a cross
You're
between,
spoiling it.
yeah, okay. A cross between like Singapore, Thailand, with a European feel. Yeah, it's amazing.
Unreal. Oh man, I can't wait.
Right. Do you have your first question, Lauren?
Why did you make a book?
I would say that when you step into the world of Bitcoin, there's lots of books. If you want to get really, really technical, you can have a look at Antonopoulos. If you want to go down the philosophical route, you've got Robert Breedlove. You can go Michael Saylor if you want to go corporate. But there weren't many books that speak to the average person and that try to distill down Bitcoin and money for just a working individual. And so the hidden cost of money was my attempt at trying to explain how money works and the repercussions of our current monetary system for the average person. That I would say that's why I wrote it.
And you did a great job, by the way.
Right, to make it easier, basically for
Yeah.
people.
Absolutely. And did you know that your dad also wrote a part of the book?
No.
Yeah, if you look at the very, very front, I think it says Daniel Prince forward. Do you see that? Well, actually, I
What?
should probably just turn it that way.
Yep.
What? You never tell me anything.
But I I was locked away in my office writing it for long enough.
I thought you was.
You wouldn't have listened even if I had told you. Yeah.
You'll be surprised how much I listen.
Okay, sure, sure, sure.
But your dad wrote a phenomenal foreword, and definitely a lot of energy has gone into it. So honestly, I really, really appreciate it, Prince. Yeah, it means the world.
Very humbling for you to reach out and ask in the first place, mate. And yeah, I appreciate having the opportunity and the work that you're doing. Not just this book, but the other one, because we were talking to Daz just yesterday morning. Well, Lauren wasn't; she was out. But we did get those books that Daz shipped across with the Wizard of Oz, Beers for Bitcoin, that you
Mhm.
co-wrote with Daz.
Amazing. No, because I know I want to send you one of these copies, but you mentioned dealing with postal services is just a nightmare.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Even to be 100% honest, I've been trying to ship this within Canada, and it's just kind of, I don't know, a normal size book. It is cheaper for me to ship the book to anywhere in the States. It can be the southern states than it is for me to ship it to Vancouver, which it has to go through Vancouver to get down to the States. And it's like almost twice the price to just ship to Vancouver, which is an hour and a half for me. It's mind
So
blowing.
the reason I tell authors not to ship books to me now is because when the book reaches the door, the postman or the post lady, whoever's on duty that day, will knock on the door, wait for us to answer it, and then demand 12 euros or more,
Like 22 euro.
depending on what it is. Yeah. So the trading cards the other day that Aladdin shipped to me cost me 22 euros to receive.
No way.
Yeah. I'm like, this is, and so I question, where does this money go? Oh, it
Yeah.
says, c'est pour l'État. It's for the state. I'm like, well, this is like, stop. We have to stop this because it's not going towards you. You're demanding this money on behalf of the state.
Mhm.
The state is earning more than the author, the person that did the actual work, and earning more than you, the person, who actually made the delivery.
Mhm.
They just rent seek in the middle. So
Oh no, I guess we have to go see them.
yeah, well, we're going to see Seven Madeira, and we'll get a copy there and a nicely signed copy as well. So that'll be something to look forward to. But yeah, for any plebs out there, we need pleb mail services. There's got to be a solution somehow.
I feel like Pleb Mail is just kind of like loading up books on any of the Bitcoiners that are traveling around and getting them to deliver.
There you go. That's the perfect way to do it, right? Whoever, if somebody can coordinate that, like I'm traveling to XYZ country or XYZ conference, ship me a box of books and I'll deliver them, or
Or
I'll come and get them, or whatever. There's a way to do it.
Mhm.
someone there could who could get the books and then deliver it to you at the conference.
Yeah,
That lives in that country.
there are ways. There are plenty of traveling nomadic plebs that would happily help for free or even for some sats. They can earn themselves some sats for doing this. And it's not just books,
Probably be
right?
called like BitBook or something.
Well, it's not just books, it'd be hardware wallets and all kinds of stuff. Block clocks, for example. To get a block clock delivered to the EU, like forget it. I think it's more expensive than the block clock. It is just a
Yeah.
joke.
I like the name BitBook though. That's pretty good.
There's your next book. All right. Well, thanks, Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
See ya. Bye.
All right, mate. So, first of all, congrats. Well done. I've seen your tweets. It certainly looks as though you've been kind of overwhelmed with the response. Can you give us some kind of insights to what you've been feeling and experiencing since you released it?
Honestly, I've been totally blown away. I had so people that may be unfamiliar, this book, The Hidden Cost of Money, I started writing it, and when was it? November of 2022. And it took me about a year to write, but that's also a culmination of probably 10 years previous of content consumption and kind of digesting, kind of distilling down all this information, kind of squeezed into that 1 year time span. And so I released it in early December, and really, like, it's one of those things when you put so much time and energy into something, it's more about me just putting it out there. And I didn't really have any expectation for how it would do outside of I just wanted to be able to support people in their journey. And about a month or two before, Preston had reached out, and I assume he may have heard whether it's through Foss or through Jeff Booth, because I know Jeff Booth had a copy. And he had just like, hey, I'd love to have you on the podcast. And I was in awe because Preston is definitely hugely influential in my own personal journey. And so I ended up jumping on the podcast. We recorded it, and then we had it set so it would release 2 days after I'd released the book. And the book just blew up, and it ended up hitting #1 bestseller on all 3 categories in Amazon globally. And I was totally just like starstruck to see my book next to some of these huge high-flying authors like Lynn Alden and Saifedean, and it's incredible. I feel absolutely humbled, and yeah, I'm just trying to, you know what, I'd say my word for this year is just kind of surrender and be present, because it's really easy to sometimes think ahead and constantly be looking into the future. And I think sometimes being able to just sit with it and allow things to just flow naturally is important.
Yeah, 100%. And what was there a particular chapter that grabbed Preston?
You know what? There's in the podcast, I know that he was pretty excited to talk about kind of the environmental issue of money. And I think a lot of people, as I talk about in the book, I don't think people quite understand just how profound of an effect money has on every single aspect of society. It really weaves its influence into whether it is the environmental side of things, because as our money is worth less, we're incentivized to consume because our purchasing power is most in this present moment. And for consumption, it's going to use resources, or whether it is, as we've talked about in the past, the parent-child bond. When money is worth less over time, parents have to work more to support the kids. If they're working more, they're spending less time with their kids, and their kids are looking to their peers. So kids lack the idea of kind of individuating and understanding who they are. Or whether you're looking at like politicians and government. When the government has a money printer, it doesn't have to offer value to society. It can simply just print to be able to fund operations without support from the populace. And then you can go into a whole host of other things, which I discuss, whether it's totalitarianism and how we're leaning towards more and more controlling structures because of the way our monetary system is set up, or whether it's diving into poor business practices, because if you've got governments bailing out businesses, it doesn't incentivize productive value creation. And so I think it's fascinating because there's so many different avenues which money touches. And I just don't necessarily think the average individual understands, oh, I didn't realize that was because of our money system, or digging below the surface of this is because of our monetary system. And that's what I really want to try and illuminate.
Yeah, and you do a great job. And I've seen a lot of plebs on Twitter talking about the book, and in particular being drawn to the one about the child-parent bond, which is great to see. And I know for people listening to this, they should go back and find our original episode, because we did a deep dive into that before, into Hold On to Your Kids by Gebel Mate, which you reference in the book as well. But we can certainly, skim over that again, because it's clearly resonating with people. And Bitcoin Twitter has been on fire with Bitcoin babies over the last 3 months, or Bitcoin pregnancies, which is so great to see, very heartwarming. So how did you start thinking about getting that chapter into the book? Because obviously it's not one. I think why people are resonating, it's taken them off guard. It's like, what's this doing in here? And actually, what is the actual title of that chapter? I had it here. Let's get it word for word.
I have it here as well if you need it.
Yeah, go on.
Money, parenthood, and self-identity. How money influences the family unit.
Yeah, man, there's so much in there. Was that okay? Let's go for it. What was that a chapter you definitely always knew that you wanted to get in there? Was that one of the like how did you kind of structure the book and get all of these, ducks in a row?
I would actually say that chapter is maybe the reason why the book was written in the first place. Because when we did that talk a little while back, maybe a year, 18 months ago, that talk was about an article that I'd written, which basically dived into the parent-child bond and how money was impacting the parent-child bond. And when I released that article, I had quite a few, 20, 30 people reach out saying, this needs to be a book. And so from there, I started to write more about the parent-child bond. But what I realized is that when actually I handed it out to quite a lot of people, although they're interested in it, they lose interest if you're writing too much about it. And so that's where I started to realize, okay, I've got to dive into all these other aspects of money so that people can get a more holistic view on things. But it took me by surprise, because what I'm really starting to recognize is that for a long time, I thought I was very unique, because whenever I'm in the dating world, women these days, nobody wants to freaking have kids. And it just blows me away. It is so hard to find people that actually want to have kids. And to me, that is a product of our broken monetary system. It is a product of our broken monetary system, because when the cost of living is rising, when it is so extortionate to be able to get into a house, to be able to actually even to be able to afford the food you want to be able to eat, people don't even think for a second that, well, maybe I want to bring a kid into this world. And so as they're getting squeezed from all angles, their focus is on themselves. There's a saying that I say in the book that I really resonate with, which is fear closes our aperture of awareness. And so I think that society today is squeezing us from all angles, so much so that people, they don't feel comfortable about bringing a child into this world. But not only that, we're also getting all of this pressure from the mainstream narratives, regardless of their truth, saying, well, we've got climate change. How can you bring a kid into this world? We've got overpopulation. Where are we going to feed these kids? And my belief is that all of that is total BS. And the reality is actually we've got a declining population in many countries. China is meant to see the population half up until 2050. Canada is meant to see over the next 10 years, 60 years old and above, it's meant to increase 60% versus 60 years old and below is only meant to increase 10%. The US has had the slowest growth rate in the last 100 years. What you start to realize is globally, we have an aging population. And if we have an aging population in a debt-based system, that is a huge problem, because people are going to start retiring, but who's going to be working and supporting this debt? And so the system starts to collapse in on itself. And so I think we have a huge problem where people are not having kids. People are not thinking about having kids. And on top of that, because people are being stretched, people are also the ones that are having kids later in life. And when you're having kids later in life, then you do have higher risks for Down syndrome, higher risks for a lot of these health issues, or there's higher risks of just health issues in general. So I think that Bitcoin is fascinating, because all of a sudden, and as we'll probably talk about it, it shifts your incentives, it shifts your time preference to thinking long term. And when you start thinking long term, you're just like, I think one of the best things you can possibly do is to have kids, to be able to bring someone into this environment and to be able to instill the ethos and the values which you've learned, especially that Bitcoin kind of display. I think that it is profound. And so hopefully, as we see more and more Bitcoin adoption, we see the shift towards realizing the potential of what kids can bring, not only individually, but also globally and economically.
Oh, it gets so dark, doesn't it, when you start going down these rabbit holes, and how eugenics has been weaved into society, and the use of the broken money, basically, that and the narratives around, like, people actually believe that the planet is going to fall out of the sky and we shouldn't bring kids into this world. And like, it's just incredible. And I can't believe that a smart person, in air quotes, with a 4-year university degree actually believes that shit. It's incredible.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. You know what? There's a quote, and I'm trying to remember where I saw it. I think it was on one of the Safer Dean podcasts, and he was just like, and it's more related to food, but the same thing applies. And he was saying, look, I don't know a single animal that has diabetes or obesity or health issues, but I also don't know a single animal that's got a PhD in nutrition or is a nutritionist. And the reality is that all
Yeah.
of these accolades don't support us in deepening our understanding. To be honest, more and more what I'm realizing, and I would say one of the biggest takeaways from writing this book was actually just understanding how intervention really does mask the underlying root cause. And I truly think it's profound. I know Lao Tzu, with like Taoist kind of philosophy, he talks about action by no action. And I think it's so important to be able to actually allow things to percolate, allow things to organically evolve, as opposed to constantly intervening. And I think that a lot of this, whether it's the medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the healthcare industry, the food industry, the educational industry, a lot of this is all about just intervention, like create change. I want it now. And the reality is that you're creating all of these byproducts, all of these symptoms. Whereas if you actually allow the natural order of things to unfold, you allow kids to find interest at their own pace, you start to realize that they grow into themselves far more efficiently and far more comfortably.
Yeah, absolutely. And God forbid they become the people they were supposed to be. Right? You know, as we all go through this Bitcoin rabbit hole journey, and many of us get released from our fiat lives. I mean, you didn't know you were going to be writing a book about Bitcoin 10 years ago, probably not even 3 years ago, 2 years ago. But you, like, because Bitcoin, you hold Bitcoin and you understand Bitcoin, you've done the hard yards, you have now put yourself in a position to be able to become the person that you're supposed to be and become this educating force of nature that you're turning into. Already 2 books under your belt, and heavily involved with, well, co-founded Looking Glass and heavily involved with Dushan's project as well, and helping other educational institutions around the world, you know, push Bitcoin. Where would we be without you, Seb? You know, if you hadn't have found Bitcoin, we wouldn't have Seb.
Yeah, honestly, you're too kind, but and I do attribute Bitcoin to being able to release me from like the shackles of fiat, not only just in my thinking, but also obviously financially. As Bitcoin, as our purchasing power increases over time, we have more capacity to look inwards and understand who I am, and also to look outwards and understand how I want to contribute. And it's interesting, kind of going back to that question you asked a little while back, like how did a lot of this come about? And I would say that when I started looking back on my childhood, I really started to recognize that my childhood was shaped by money. It was because when I was young, and we discussed this in your other podcast, when I was young, my parents separated at a very early age. And because they separated, my mum had to support my 2 brothers and I. So we used to live in this little 2-bedroom, tiny little place in Wimborne down south in the UK. And she used to struggle to kind of put the roof over the head and food on the table. So she used to have to work while we used to have to go out and spend time with our friends, and we looked to our peers for relation. But the problem with looking to our peers for relation is we're all learning together. We didn't necessarily have our immediate needs met, our emotional needs met, because we were simply trying to fit in. And so we want to look the same, we want to sound the same, we want to have the same mannerisms. And so we lose that soul, we lose that individuation as to who I am. And so, secondly, I started to realize there was a specific event, and I mention it in the book, which is when I was about 9 years old. There was a scooter that I really wanted. The scooter was like, I saw it in the toy store and I was just enamored by it. And so I saved up for about 3 months to go and buy the scooter. And I walked in there with my dad and my 2 brothers. And as we walked up to the till to go pay for the scooter, my dad was like, "Oh man, I feel bad that you're getting the scooter and your brothers aren't." And so he ended up buying my brothers a scooter and I had to pay for my scooter. And what I realize now as an adult is that this is something called the Cantillon effect. And the Cantillon effect is those closest to the monetary spigot benefit disproportionately. But this is kind of the Cantillon effect on a microcosm of a family, whereby those closest to the monetary spigot, i.e., the parents, benefit disproportionately. My brothers have always lent into my parents, maybe a lot more than I have. I've always been a lot more free market, but it also shows politically. They're a lot more left leaning now as adults, whereas I would say I'm a lot more free market, Austrian kind of approach. And then the final thing is when I've always been passionate about mountain biking. And so I lent into the mountain bike industry very early on, started teaching mountain biking. And all of a sudden I was working with these idols that I used to see in all the movies. I used to see them on TV. And all of a sudden you're working with these individuals and you realize they're struggling to get by. They're struggling to afford rent. None of them own property. They're up to their neck in credit card debt. And this really opened my eyes. It hugely opened my eyes because I started to realize that the world is a hard place. The world is very unfair. And even if no matter how much time and energy you put into something, it doesn't mean you're going to be rewarded for it. And it made me realize that I had to look to create passive income externally, passive income somewhere, whether it's from other investments, to be able to try and get ahead. And so that is what ultimately led me down the rabbit hole of money and investing, because I was pursuing a mountain bike career, but I realized I needed an alternate monetary stream. And so then I went down investing. And as you go down investing, you start looking at the financial markets. As you start looking at the financial markets, you start realizing the positions aren't going the way that I was expecting them to in a free market. And then you start realizing, what's below the cover of this? What's under the hood? You start looking into intervention, start looking into gold, and then Bitcoin. And that led me here. And I've recognized that our monetary environment profoundly impacts everything around us. Money profoundly matters. So when it is tinkered with, when it is altered against what the free market deems as valuable and viable to them, you get all of these byproducts.
Well, you get no signal. It's all
100%.
noise. And you get a complete and utter total malinvestment everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows the true price or value of anything because the money has been completely and utterly screwed with, tinkered with, manipulated. And for a few people's gain. And subsidies, right? You hit on subsidies in your book. And I think that is a really good thing for noobs to really dig into. And for people that are trying to figure out what's going on in the world and why food prices are where they are and whatever else. And you've got some really good examples of how subsidies affect the shit we eat. The shit is on our supermarket shelves because you said there are 3 crops: corn, wheat, and soy, I think, just ridiculously subsidized. So do you want to riff on that a little bit and try and explain to people that might be struggling with this concept of why? Because of course we think government subsidies are great. Oh, we're bailing out the farmers. Oh, they don't. They're the poor farmers. They're struggling. They need the subsidies because they're the ones that feed us. And the narrative is very strong and everybody's on board with, yes, go ahead and subsidize the farmers. Gives me a good feeling to know that my tax dollars are going to help the people. This gaslighting machine is so strong. So do you want to blow the lid off what subsidies are actually doing under the hood?
Oh man, absolutely. So in the book, actually, I didn't expand on it too much. This is one of the chapters that actually I wanted to write a whole chapter on, and the book was just getting too big. I was like, so I ended up just chucking it at the bottom of the business subsidies section. But when you start diving into subsidies, you realize how pervasive they are and how they create all of these unintended effects. And you can't plan this stuff out before you start intervening with subsidies. But I'll give you an example. So in around the 40s and the 50s, the government started subsidizing grain production. And when the government started subsidizing grain production, what does that do to farmers? Well, it incentivizes the farmers to start growing grain against a lot of other products, because now they can actually increase and gain an artificial margin on a product that actually doesn't have that much demand for. So all of a sudden, we started to see a ton of grain production, a ton of farmers transitioning from traditional agriculture over to grain production. And so grain products started booming. And then we saw the rise of the big corporations like Kellogg's and Quakers. And all of a sudden, they had a ton of money. And because they had all of this money, what do they start doing with this money? Well, they want to ensure that they're able to compete into the future. So they go start lobbying. And so as they start lobbying the government, they start pushing the FDA to create the food pyramid. And people probably know of the food pyramid. And if you look at traditionally what we used to eat, it was predominantly animal-based products with fruit. And if we could find vegetables, we would eat vegetables. But pre-agricultural revolution, vegetables are not something we grew. That's only post-agricultural revolution. We used to eat a lot of fruit. We were scavengers. We'd eat what we could find. And animals were actually one of the easier things to find. But when the government started being pressured by these big grain companies and lobbying started taking place, they pushed the FDA to create the food pyramid. And in the food pyramid, they basically, I would outwardly say, they fraudulently created a bunch of studies that said, we cannot digest animal products effectively. It creates heart disease. It creates health issues, you name it. And so they created the food pyramid. And at the base of the food pyramid, what do they have? They have grains. With at the top of the food pyramid, at the tiny little point at the top, you have animal products and how saturated fats are bad. And so all of a sudden, we've been kind of ingrained to believe that animal products are bad and we should be eating grain products. And so what has happened since the 50s and 60s? We have seen obesity skyrocket. It's just gone absolutely exponential. And what do you see in all of the grocery stores? Low-fat foods. And the reality is that it is completely the inverse. Fat doesn't make you fat. What makes you fat is grains. Grains and artificial carbs make you fat. It's why at the end of a cow's life cycle, they start feeding it grain, or even halfway through its life cycle, they start feeding it grain, because it increases a cow's size by 30 to 40%. But it also makes it massively sedentary and obese, and it has basically metabolic issues, which is why it's got so much fat in the meat. When you look at a grass-fed cow, it's half the size, but the reality is it's eating its natural diet. And so you start to realize there is a lot of these incentives for these for certain corporations with subsidies, given that they now have so much excess capital, to then go and push and distort truth. And so this is where it's really interesting, because the whole world has bought into certain beliefs that are absolutely flawed in terms of their basis. And as you mentioned, like 97% of the world's subsidies go towards grains, and 3 grains in particular. And so I don't think people quite understand just how pervasive these subsidies are. And now, because of all of this excess grain that we've had, what do they do with the excess grain? They start creating things like high fructose corn syrup. And all of that stuff is now in all of our foods. Even if you buy, I think I was looking at something the other day, in Canada, with Hayden's tomato ketchup, at least we have cane sugar. But if you look in the States, it's high fructose corn syrup. This stuff
Everywhere.
is heinous, absolutely heinous. And then it's also led into seed oils. And I know Max DeMarco's just put out a short little documentary, I think it's about 20 minutes long on YouTube, and he talks about seed oils in depth. But diving into, I would say, if anyone is interested in diet nutrition, the first thing anyone should do, no matter what your background, whether you're eating meat, vegetables, you name it, should be to remove seed oils from your diet. And seed oils stem from these artificial solvent-based processes to extract oil from all of these excess grain products that literally, if you try and squeeze a seed, how much oil do you get out of it? You get barely anything. So they have to use solvents to extract the oil. So most of the seed oils, whether it's sunflower oil, canola oil, that are sitting in our cupboards, they're just absolutely, they're metabolic disorders in a pill or in an oil, ready to go. Like they're destroying society.
They are just beyond disgusting. And we are we're in the UK at the moment, and we've been here a few days, so we're going around trying to find the best shops and with the best products, the local meat and whatever else. And sure enough, you walk into even like the cool little delis, right? That are selling all of the nice Indian curry sauces or the Italian sauces, this, that, and the other thing. All looks great, great branding, great marketing, whatever. It looks bespoke and it looks artisanal. And you pick it up. Rapeseed oil seems to be the biggest offender in the UK, from what I can see. Sunflower is a close second. And it's like, damn it. Like, when are people going to wake up to this? It's just absolutely incredible to me. I mean, the Bitcoiners, I don't know, man. We seem to be ahead of the curve on so many different things, not just the money, but maybe because we're ahead of the curve on the money, we see through the bullshit of everything else, and the subsidies being a perfect example of this. And I remember as well reading in the book, I've pulled it up here, people might not be aware of the Aral Sea or the Aral Sea, however you would pronounce it. So why don't you explain to people, and this is in your environmental chapter as well, how damaging subsidizing a particular, well, first of all, everybody knows monocropping is bad, right? Hands up in the classroom. Is monocropping bad? Yes. Okay, so wheat, soy, and corn, they're all monocrops, they're all subsidized. This particular story, you talk about cotton, another monocrop. So go ahead, mate. The floor is yours. Why do subsidies wreck the environment?
Well, and I'll jump back for 10 seconds quickly and just say, I think what is so fascinating about the Bitcoiner kind of ethos is that it is to question. And the reality is that everyone should be questioning. But as our monetary environment is slowly causing us and squeezing us, impeding our ability to kind of have time and space to be able to think, we just kind of take a lot of the content at face value. And so Bitcoin is what I absolutely love about this community, and I hope that we never stop, is that they're constantly questioning. And that includes not only questioning the bad, but also questioning our internal beliefs and questioning our friends. I think that a healthy relationship is one where you should be able to ask questions. A healthy relationship is not one where you just have to trust what someone is saying. So anyway, to the Aral Sea, or the Aral Sea, I have no idea how to pronounce it. Anyway, so what a lot of people, this is something that actually I'd never heard of until I started digging into the effects of subsidies in society. So the Aral Sea is, and the actual location, where is it again? Completely blanked on the actual location.
Russia.
It's kind of between Russia and
Hang on a second. The Aral Sea in Central Asia is a haunting example of environmental destruction caused by such behavior. Then
yeah.
you mentioned Beatrice Grabish, who exposes the catastrophic effects of the Soviets' aggressive policy of agricultural expansion. And yeah, thanks to the Soviet Union's relentless pursuit of cotton just 65 years ago, Central Asia experienced rapid depletion. So Central Asia is all.
So I think it's Central Asia, the actual specific location I've completely blanked on. But anyway, that the Aral Sea at one point was the fourth largest body of water in the freshwater body of, is it freshwater or saltwater body of water in the world, or the fourth largest lake in the world. And that's a huge lake. Today, it is 90% smaller. And the reason why is because of subsidies. What ended up happening is, at the time, the USSR, they realized, okay, we want to try and produce cotton. Now, the reality is in a free market, if there is demand for cotton, supply will slowly increase to meet demand. As prices start to rise from increased demand, as those suppliers start to have more profit from prices rising, they can then invest in growth, they can expand. This is the natural free market phenomena. But what ends up happening is the inverse when governments start to tinker and they start intervening. So all of a sudden, they started subsidizing cotton production without that demand, well and above beyond the actual demand of society. And so they started basically planting cotton fields all around the sea because it has two main rivers that flow in. So they've got abundance in water. But as they started planting all of this cotton, they started to use pesticides. All those pesticides started seeping into the water and they started to kill all of the fish. Well, a lot of the locals around this fourth largest basically body of water in the world, they started struggling. They started to get sick. They started to get ill. And then on top of that, because they were using so much water consumption from trying to plant artificial amounts of cotton, naturally it started to deplete the water in the lake. That is mind-blowing. So it started to deplete this body of water, so much so that now it's lost 90% of its volume. But then, because it's lost 90% of its volume, it now starts to alter the local climate. Because that body of water that body of water will dictate the cloud formations, it will dictate the wind, the waves, big body of water for wind to pick up across. All of a sudden, they started having much colder and drier winters and much warmer and less precip summers. And so you're now starting to see how just because of subsidies coming in and creating artificial supply above and beyond what the free market deems as kind of in demand, all of a sudden you actually started impacting the natural environment. And I think that a lot of people don't understand to what extent this is happening today. But even take our cell phones, for instance. Our cell phones, I think, have something about 10 grams of cobalt in every single cell phone. Well, that cobalt, 70% of that cobalt comes from mines that are mined in unethical conditions, where kids are in there, you name it. And they're going in there, and whether it's Africa, a bunch in the Middle East, they're going in there and trying to obtain this cobalt from the most horrendous conditions. They're destroying forests for it. They're just digging down into the earth, and people are getting sick. And so a lot of this stuff, we're destroying our environment, whether it is through subsidies like the Aral Sea or even just through consumption, because as money is worth less over time, we're incentivized to consume. But this consumption is not legitimate consumption. It is artificial consumption from a broken monetary system. Because if you think about it, if money had a fixed supply, as our technology advanced, as productivity increased, our purchasing power would actually increase. But what is interesting about that is if our purchasing power is increasing, what are we now incentivized to do? We're incentivized to save instead of consume. And so this is phenomenal for our environment, because all of a sudden, if we're now incentivized to save over consume, people are going to be a hell of a lot more cautious and conscious about how they spend and what they spend their money on. So if there's less capital flooding into consumerism, first off, all of those businesses that have stretched themselves financially are going to wither away. And second off, the ones that are remaining are now going to have to compete for those consumer dollars. And what are they going to have to do? They're going to raise the quality of products, whether it's looking for more sustainable resources or it's using renewables, you name it. And so I think it's interesting because you're actually changing the consumption habits just by altering the money. And I think that's one of the most profound things about money. But anyway, getting a little bit off topic, I think when you start subsidizing the economy, when you start intervening monetarily, you create these byproducts. And it's wild to track back something like the Aral Sea and realize that because you created artificial cotton, and that artificial cotton uses a ton of water, and that ton of water has to come from somewhere, which is the fourth largest body of water in the world, which is now a fraction of its size, you've actually changed the local environment. You've altered all of the farming communities around there, all of the local the local populace. They've now got illnesses. They've had to move away. You've altered the natural climate. It is profound how money can impact the world around us.
And tanked the price of cotton because
And
because you've oversupplied. It's a lose win situation. And who wins? The motherfuckers that print the cash in the first place. It's like, you know, and it's between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan for those that were you know, wanted to know exactly where it was. But it's a great case study, and one, again, I think a lot of people listening to this probably already know this, but I think what we've got to get better at is sharpening our tools at delivering the message to our friends, family, and, you know, just the general normie around us about how printing money blindly into an economy is absolutely raping us of our purchasing power. And the way I try, the best way I try and deliver it to a normie is a pint of beer is especially if you're talking to a, you know, a contemporary guy of 30 to 50 years of age, around this, you know, like been drinking beer for a long time. You remember when beer was like £1.50, £1.70? Yeah. Well, why has that changed? Oh, well, it's inflation. Yeah. Well, it's the same liquid, dude. It's the same amount of liquid. It's a pint, and it's the same brand. Like, you don't think that they got better at making that and can make it in more quantity, and you don't think that they got more efficient at the logistical rollout and supplying the pubs? Do you really think that the supply is less than it was 30 years ago when we first started drinking? And then and then do milk, right? I mean, come on, milk. When we were growing up in the UK, you probably remember this. You probably had milk delivered on your doorstep, right? That doesn't even happen anymore. So that industry even managed to employ tens of thousands of milkmen up and down the country with their, you know, their floats, their electric floats and whatever else. That's all gone. But a pint of milk is still a pint of milk. But what's happened is now it's white water, right? It's not even milk anymore. It's the money, guys. You cannot print all of this money into the system because that is eroding our purchasing power. But we've got to get better as a community at delivering these messages. And like, this is why your book is so important. And I'm sure it's why it's resonating with so many Bitcoiners, because let's face it, Bitcoiners are the ones picking it up first to read it.
Oh, totally. And it's interesting. The milk was one of the things, actually, again, like I wanted to throw it in the book, but it's fascinating when you dive into kind of more of the history of milk, because traditionally milk has always been raw. We've been drinking raw milk since the dawn of time. This is actually a raw milk smoothie. And here in Canada and in most countries, raw milk is illegal. It's harder to get raw milk, or it's easier to get cocaine and freaking heroin in Canada here now that it's been decriminalized than it is to get raw milk. That is just absolutely mind-blowing. But again, why did this happen? And it's interesting because when you trace it back, you start to realize that the Great Depression, which happened because of intervention, because the government wasn't able to service its debts, ultimately ended up in the economy was on its knees. Now, because the economy was on its knees and the government was kind of intervening, a lot of these big dairy producers, they were struggling to be able to feed their cattle. Well, they still had to make ends meet. So what did they start doing? They started going to the distilleries and the breweries and taking the slop, the leftover byproduct from the production line, taking that and feeding it to the cows. The cows started to get immensely sick. And so all of a sudden, and this was specifically more around New York and other areas in the States, they started selling this milk from these cows that were super ill and basically just eating garbage. And the New Yorkers and the populace started to get sick. And because the New Yorkers and the populace started to get sick, they had to do something about it. So some guy was like, well, why don't we start pasteurizing milk? Why don't we start heating it up to kill the bacteria in the milk? But when you kill the bacteria, well, you're killing both the good and the bad bacteria. So now you've just got white water that is just garbage. You're drinking white water and it's got really no nutritional value to it. And so then the government ended up realizing, okay, well, people aren't getting sick if they pasteurize it. So why don't we just put in a regulation that says milk has to now be pasteurized? And that regulation ended up spreading widely. Canada has employed it across all of Canada. I know the majority, like in the UK, I think you still can buy raw milk from the farmer directly, but you cannot buy it in any stores. You cannot buy it, you're not allowed to sell it in retail spaces. And in most countries, raw milk is illegal. And so this is just heinous, because when you actually start realizing that the milk we're drinking in grocery stores, all of it has been pasteurized, most of it has been homogenized, and that's just decimated its nutritional value. You've removed all of the good probiotics, all of the good bacteria that helps our gut and supports us. And now many people, it's something like 80% of people that are dairy intolerant, if you go and drink raw milk, you have no problem with raw milk. And it's because these cows are being fed grain. And when they're being fed grain, that cow cannot digest that grain effectively. And so you're getting a lot of the toxins from grain. People that are even have grain allergies or gluten allergies many times respond to milk, because you're getting a lot of the toxins from the cow eating grain its whole life. And so I highly recommend anyone to go out there and dig into whether it's the history of milk, or try and get your hands on raw milk, because it is far superior to the white stuff that you're getting in the grocery store.
And this also crosses into this idea of de-engineering humanity, right? Because yes, the money is one story of it, and then there's this the darker side of it is, you know, the Malthusian invisible hand that is steering the money printer behind the politicians, because the politicians, they get lobbied to do these things, or they make promises to certain people to get the funding that they need to be able to run the campaign effectively, so that they can, you know, win the popularity contest come the time. That they've got certain debts to pay and certain favors to you know, to make good on. And yeah, I don't know, man. Like there is all of the food is just junk, and it's killing us. And it's so difficult for people to understand that it is directly linked to the money.
Totally. There's a chart, and I saw this chart a couple years ago, and to be honest, I think that it makes a lot of sense. We have seen the rise of the kind of, the LGBTQ population, and at the same time, what we've also seen a rise of is soy production. And as we see more soy production, which is from subsidies, we start to see more people being confused about their gender. Why is this? Well, soy is an endocrine disruptor. Soy mimics estrogen. In women, it is not estrogen. It mimics estrogen. It actually blocks a lot of receptors for estrogen. So now all of a sudden, women are starting to have this hormonal imbalance in their body, and that creates confusion. The same thing for men. If it's mimicking estrogen, a lot of men start acting more feminine. That's how men grow man boobs, because of a lot of these endocrine disruptors that are in soy. But there's a chart that I saw that basically showed that the increase in people identifying as anything other than male and female is like 99% correlated with soy production. And I'd love to try and find that chart again, because I saw it a little while back. But I think that this is, again, it's stemming from, why are we having this soy production? We're having this soy production because there's subsidies. Those subsidies are creating artificial margins for businesses to move from other forms of agriculture to soy production. And so again, it traces back to the money. And that's not to say I have nothing against this type of people that identify as the opposite sex, you name it. But I think it's about understanding, why is this coming about, and what is the repercussions of this? Because it is breaking down society. It is breaking down both male and female rights that people have been fighting for thousands of years, when we're going down this artificial, I can identify as this, you can identify as that, you name it.
Now, some people might be getting triggered by that. And so I'm going to help you out and back you up on this claim, because I had Dr. Anthony J on the show. People can go back and listen to that. And he wrote the book, Estrogeneration. And if you've not read it, I certainly, it sounds like you know a lot of it already, but we talked about this exact thing, this exact topic. I brought it up with him, and he links it directly. And he's had a lot of phone calls from people since they've read the book who have had this confusion in their life. They link it directly to the soy in baby food, in baby formula, because women are busy and they're not around to, and again, directly linked to the money, mate, because they're all out trying to earn the wage. And again, you talk about this in the book, double earning families, right? And the hockey stick rise of double earning families. the mother isn't around the baby, or the mother is there's something else going on as well, because there is way too many women out there now that believe or are told that they are unable to breastfeed from a young age, and that's directly linked to the money, because it's directly linked to the training that the medical industry gives, which is backed by big pharma who make these soy products such as the baby formula. And it's the same with the drugs and, you know, diabetic pens and all this kind of thing. You know, the medical, pharmaceutical, agricultural complex, it's all one great big turning wheel of money incentivized demonic decision making at the end of the day. But linked directly, the Dr. Anthony J linked it directly to copious amounts of soy in baby formula. Copious. So if you've got a 3-month-old baby and they're drinking this 3 or 4 times a day, don't be surprised in 12 to 13 years time when that kid is completely like the body has not been able to develop in the way it naturally should have done.
But I couldn't agree more. I didn't mention it in the book, but I mentioned it in that article when I talked about kind of the impact of money on parenting. And one of the things I discussed is, like, when I was born, the first thing the lady did, because I was, I think, a month premature, the nurse took me and just put a bottle straight into my mouth. Again, my mum had even mentioned before I was born, I do not want Seb on any form of formula, because it's all over the hospital walls. It's just freaking posters left, right, and center. They even give you baskets with formula for free. And so it's wild to see such intense push and pressure from nurses, from a lot of these industries. And so I was basically put on formula, and then it became next to impossible, because all of a sudden I've been basically given this sugary, high calorific oil, and I was in love with it. So then it took my mum a week to get me and wean me off a lot of this formula, even though I'd only had it once or twice, to then get me back onto the breast. Because what a lot of people don't necessarily realize is that breast milk is more than just milk. That you have been born in that environment, and your mum has made that milk specifically for you. It's got the antibodies that you need to be able to survive. And what is even more fascinating is that when our immune system becomes compromised, if we catch a cold in the early years of life, while we're still breastfeeding, what ends up happening is that as we start to bite onto the teat recognizes your immune system is compromised, and the mum's immune system will start to create antibodies, feed it through the milk to the child to then protect the child. That doesn't happen with formula. Formula is basically just sugar, seed oils, and soy products. And so when you even start diving into the studies, you start to realize that kids that are on formula have much higher risk of obesity. They have exponentially high risks of diabetes. They have much worse health outcomes. Their immune systems are shot. It is mind-blowing at just the impact of, again, money, subsidies, creating artificial products.
And everything about modern day birthing techniques is all about detachment at the second from birth. And it's so sick, man. It's like, what are we doing? And it's great to see again that Bitcoiners are on top of this. I saw a great thread the other day from a Bitcoin mom, and I can't remember her name. You might have seen the same thread, but she's talking about it's a stupid thing to even call it potty training or toilet training, but they're bringing their kid up that no nappy is ever going to touch that kid's bum. You know, they'll have, because she was saying that you get signals from the child. It basically gives you the signal when it needs to eject something. And really long thread. I wish I could remember the name, but really interesting. And for me, you know, I'm way past those days. Did all the wrong things. Luckily, we didn't do formula. We did the nappy thing, but that was, oh, man.
But people just don't know. And that's the thing that I really struggle with, is that I don't blame people. I think people are, and this is the unfortunate reality, is that as money is worth less over time, people have to go and work more. As people have to go and work more, they have less time to consciously think about the information they're consuming. They have less time to critically think. Now, I do put some onus on people actually stepping outside and actually trying to question things, but it is also a product of the system. And I just don't think people quite really understand just like how impactful it is. Like, if we think about it, and I talk about it in the book, money is the #1 stressor in the world. In the US, it's something like 76% of people have monetary stress. It's the second leading cause of divorce behind adultery. So you start to realize money is impacting all of us. We've all got this monetary stress. Well, when a mother is carrying a child and that mother is feeling an immense amount of stress, well, that triggers stress hormones. Stress hormones, whether it's epinephrine, whether it's cortisol, the baby then feels acutely. And that starts to impact the baby's nervous system, and the nervous system becomes hypersensitive. Well, when that baby now enters that world with a hypersensitive immune system from experiencing innumerable amounts of stress hormones, what does that mean? Well, we know that when we are in a threatening situation, we have fight, flight, and freeze. Let's just take freeze for a second. When our body is in freeze, what does it do? Well, we don't want to be seen. If a lion comes up to us on the plains of Africa, all of a sudden we go into freeze because we realize we're not going to be able to outrun the lion. Our hope is that the lion will walk past and not see us. So in that hope, evolutionarily, we start to slow our breathing rate. We start to slow our heart rate, which slows blood flow, which slows nutrient absorption. So it impairs our digestion. So when people have a hypersensitive immune system because of monetary stress, all of a sudden, they've got slowed nutrient absorption. They've got slower heart rate. They're struggling to get up. They feel lethargy. They struggle with sleep. And I see this time and time and time again. You start to realize that people are just lethargic. There's just so much apathy. People are just kind of giving up and they have low energy. And it's because many times our immune systems are absolutely shot. Our immune system is shot, whether it's from stress directly on us or indirectly through our parent onto us when we were going through kind of that birthing period. And so I think it's really important to talk about how money impacts us, even in those developmental years. It's super important.
Interesting that it's the number 2. It says it's the number 2 cause of divorce. I thought it would be number 1. You said adultery is number 1. I wager you could link money to adultery straight away.
Totally. And the other thing is, there's so many sources. There's just like, if you dig deep enough, you can find a source that says number 1, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Which was the hardest chapter for you to write?
So I would actually say, so there's 2 chapters. I think it's 9 and 10, and I dive into how money creates controlling structures. And so what I mean by controlling structure is authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and basically, in short, as money breaks down society, as we continue to intervene and continue to intervene, as we start to take on more and more debt as a nation, well, naturally, if you do not service that debt, society collapses. And so because you need capital, you start to intervene more and you start to intervene more, which creates all these byproducts. And all of those byproducts then need to be regulated, so increased regulation. And so the problem is, as we start to intervene, we go down this path of increased regulation where the average person, the populace's rights and freedoms are slowly eroded. So ultimately, interventionistic monetary policy leads to totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. And if we look throughout history, this has happened time and time again. But what I think is important to discuss is that I think a lot of people have an aversion to controlling structures, the World Economic Forum, it's conspiracy theory. But the reality is there's so much evidence that this has happened time and time again throughout society. And many of these people in higher positions, you just need to look at our rights and freedoms, even in our lifetime, and realize that they're being absolutely eroded. And so the reason why it was one of the more challenging chapters is that I want to raise people's awareness to this stuff, but I don't want them to close off, because the moment they close off, they're going to shut down and they're not going to read on. And so it's about like teetering around and discussing how money creates controlling structures without giving away too much and trying to describe our current system like Hitler or you name it. So it's really, really challenging. And I spent a lot of time trying to word that in a way that didn't trigger. And especially, so I start off by describing in chapter 9 the rise of controlling structures. And then in chapter 10, I give lots of examples about how when we think about totalitarianism, we think to the extreme end. And when I say the extreme end, I'm thinking about like Mao Zedong or Stalin or Hitler. But the reality is that totalitarianism is showing itself in today in small pockets here and there, and those pockets are getting bigger and bigger. Just take Justin Trudeau during the trucker rally. You've got a bunch of people that disagree with something that a politician or the prime minister is doing. And so they're stepping up and saying, hey, we disagree with this, which is totally legal. Protesting is 100% legal in Canada. And Trudeau, because he does not want the public to see this, he does not want pushback, he starts to freeze anyone who's donated to the truckers to support the truckers. He starts to freeze their bank accounts, freeze their access to capital. And you also saw them starting to take a lot of the people bringing petrol, they're bringing gas to a lot of these truckers. And they started to go in with police and start to take a lot of this gas. They couldn't continue to protest. This is totally antithetical to a free market, or totally antithetical to even democracy. And so I very much believe that it's something we need to talk about. We need to talk about how money, when you start intervening, leads to these controlling structures. But we also need to remove a lot of our preconceptions and realize that just because we're not like Mao Zedong now, that doesn't mean that we cannot move towards that place.
Another point that we get very annoyed with, I would say, is when we're trying to have these conversations about all of this with friends, family, normies, you know, label them what you will, and they just eye roll at you as if you're some conspiracy theorist, right? Like you said, and all you're doing is laying out the facts. And it's the loss of freedoms, the loss of private property ownership, and you mentioned that in the book as well. Like, you try and tell people, like, okay, 50 to 100 years ago, who owned most of the property in your country, UK, Canada, US, wherever it was? It would have been privately owned.
Mm-hmm.
How about now? I mean, if you buy a house, who are you buying the house from? A bank. If you sell a house, who are you selling the house to? A bank. Every single time. So few people actually own their own property, and that has been eroded. Private property and the rights to own property have been expertly put out of our reach by the printing press.
Totally. And what's also fascinating is, and you're seeing this in real time right now in most nations, but I'll pick on the UK, for instance. You just need to look at capital controls that are now preventing capital from flowing outside of the UK, or even into assets that are not governed by the state. And the reason why they're doing this first is because when you have a massive debt burden, you want to be able to debase the currency and steal as much value from that currency as possible. Well, if everyone's already fled the currency, there's no value in the currency, so the currency can hyperinflate much easier. So you've got to start locking people into that currency through capital controls to be able to debase. And so I believe there's a bill, if I remember correctly, that I've seen recently, where they're trying to put in where, when it comes to Bitcoin and purchasing Bitcoin, you can only purchase something like £10,000 a month of Bitcoin. That is insane. If you were to inherit, if you were a lucky one and you were to inherit, let's say, £150,000 in your inheritance, which is, there's people that's not an overtly amount of money. If you wanted to move that into Bitcoin, it's going to take you over a year to move that into Bitcoin. That is just insane. And that is the government. They say it's for the protection of the individual. Well, Bitcoin's been the best performing asset. Basically, it's annualized something like 200% over the last 15 years. So you start to realize, who's it protecting? You're protecting them from increasing their purchasing power. Like, you're protecting them from basically not being subservient to the state. I think that it's a challenging situation, because these nations have their own incentive, and their incentive is to basically continue their functionality, continuing their rise, their power. And the way they do that is through debasement. And so they want to try and lock as many people into the currency as possible.
And then we will own nothing and be happy, Seb. Remember? By 2030. What people don't understand is they already own nothing and they're already fat and angry. Like that, that's the freaking truth of the matter right now. Nobody owns their cars, nobody owns their houses, nobody even owns their couches and their televisions. Everything's bought on credit because it's cheap money. And it's just a disaster. And to keep pushing on this point, I've highlighted it here. According to Guido Holzmann, the German-born economist, the key is to make the government financially dependent on its citizens, which addresses the fundamental political problem of controlling the people in office once they are there. Right? We are living in a clown world that is completely on its head. And Hayek, you go on to quote, as the great economist Friedrich Hayek predicted, people would seek security instead of independence under a central planning regime. Voila, that's exactly where we are today.
Totally. And what's interesting about that point is, it sounds like we need to make the government dependent on the people. The reality is, that's how a free market works. If you're a business, you are dependent on the people. You are dependent on the people because you have to offer value to society. If you're not offering value to society, no one's going to purchase your products and you're going to wither away. But that is creative destruction. You are forcing people to collaborate and to create and allow value to rise up. And it's the same thing with the government. The government should be competing just like any other business entity. It should be competing for tax dollars. If you are a government and you have a money printer, you do not have to listen to your populace. You can simply fund operations through debasement. Whereas if the government did not have the money printer, if we separate money from state, all of a sudden the government has to compete just like any other business. And given that the only way for it to obtain capital is through taxation, it now has to start listening to its populace. It has to start listening to its populace and implementing agendas that actually support the nation and allow the nation to grow and thrive. Because if it does not do that, then all of a sudden people stop paying taxes, it starts losing capital, that government withers away and another one rises up. And so this is where I truly believe, and this is obviously the Austrian economic approach, is that you need competition for value to kind of percolate to the top.
So is the hidden cost of money humanity itself?
It's interesting because I would say that people say capitalism is this thing, whether it's capitalism, socialism, communism, you name it, it's this thing that we've created as a structure. I would say that it is not a structure. I would say that that is the natural emergent property of life. All life from the dawn of time is always competing. No matter what piece of life, the single-celled organisms up to animals to plants, they're always competing with the one that is able to offer the most value, the one that is able to thrive being the one that survives. And so capitalism is the natural state of human beings. We want to give back. We want to try and create value, and the strongest and the fittest will naturally survive. But what is also interesting to separate is that just because we are capitalist and self-interested, that doesn't mean that we're not socialist on some level. I'm very socialist on my own community and those around me. I've dedicated years and years and years to giving back to the local community, creating free products, doing this, doing that, bringing kids up from Vancouver and getting them jobs and getting them integrated in society because I care and I want to give back. And I also, being self-interested, gain a lot of satisfaction with supporting and helping others. And so I think some people confuse, if you believe in capitalism, you believe in competition all the way down. And that's not necessarily true. I believe in capitalism on a big, grand scale because I think that in the grand scheme of things, people need to compete, corporations need to compete, nations need to compete. But on a personal level, on a community level, you should be able to decide to do whatever you want to do with your time. And if that means giving back to society, by all means, go and do that. And I truly admire that. But I don't believe the government should be in control of where we direct our capital. I don't believe the government should be in control of moving capital from one part of the economy to the other to support another part of the economy. Ultimately, what we end up doing is we're moving capital from a productive part of the economy, which is shown to create value, to an unproductive part of the economy. If we actually allow the tables to turn and we allow capital to flow towards where capital is being created, we're actually now thinking about humanity long term. Interventionism is only thinking about humanity short term. We're thinking about trying to prop up those pain points in society. Whereas actually, if we think about humanity long term, the thriving of the human race, I believe we've got to start thinking about how do we actually create value? How do we create collaboration? How do we incentivize value creation?
Our default instinct is, as a species, is to help each other, right? I 100% believe that. I've seen it. When we went traveling with Claire and the kids, 2.5, 3 years, we were just at the whim and mercy of the people around us in completely different countries and situations, and sometimes some pretty bad situations. Like, we needed help for whatever reason. Son split his head open, and you're relying on other people to get you to the hospital quickly, and that's when you regain a faith in humanity. But even that has been undermined because, like I said earlier, people are running around, they're angry, they're unhealthy, and they just cannot figure out, they cannot put their finger on the reason. But as long as they get their 2-week holiday somewhere in the sun, everything's good because you can just go sit on the beach and forget about it and get wrecked every night and just fear that Monday morning back at work. But that's okay, just kick the can down the road. I hope that this book breaks into the normie circles. And it's up to Bitcoiners, it's up to the plebs, it's up to people listening to buy it as gifts. That's the first thing you can do. A birthday gift. We've just obviously had Christmas, but birthday gifts and whatever else is, or just a gift. Like who decided we can only buy gifts for each other on certain days of the year? This is ridiculous. Let's get back to real human touching, and I saw this book and I thought of you, and I think this is something that you'd really enjoy.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. And it's interesting because when you talk about like the compassion and the altruism side of things, again, like going back to the money, I talk about that. There's a whole chapter I describe on money and its influence in our behavior. And I talk about compassion and altruism because in psychology, there's something which most people have heard of as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you've got kind of your base needs, which is food, shelter, then you've got relational needs, and then you go up the pyramid and you start getting up to the point self-actualization. But you cannot start moving up that pyramid unless you fulfill the base needs. And what are our base needs? Food and shelter. So as society, as we're getting squeezed, as money is worth less over time, as our cost of living is rising, as house prices are just going through the roof, it's becoming harder and harder for us to get by, which means our aperture of awareness narrows and we start trying to simply look out for ourselves because we're being threatened. And that's where we just don't have the time and capacity to give back to the extent to which we'd like. I think if we were to have a world where our purchasing power was to increase over time, we would actually be able to slowly reduce our work commitment, which gives us more time to look inwards, but also gives us more time to look outwards and actually think about how we want to show up in this world and how we want to give back. And so I do believe that if we were to alter the monetary system, you actually start to incentivize more collaboration. You start to incentivize more compassion, more altruism. It is not a product of the individual, although I think there will always be individuals, no matter the situation, that will always give back. I think that the environment also incentivizes certain behavior.
And a rebuilding of community. And
Yeah.
we've all listened to our grandmas and grandpas or great granddads, or talk about the old days, and they get this look like, I never used to be like this. You'd be able to walk, you wouldn't get halfway down the street, you've already spoken to like 5 or 6 people. Like, it doesn't happen anymore. It's really sad, and it's all linked directly to the money.
I agree.
All right, man. Well, final question, as you know, if you had one last orange pill left to give to somebody, who would you give it to and why? But I guess we should change it slightly. If you had one last copy of not Broken Money, that's Lynn's book. Shout out to Lynn. If you had one last copy, who would you give it to of your book? And why am I blanking on the hidden cost of money? The hidden cost of money. I've written the foreword to it. It's hiding right behind it. But anyway, the hidden cost of money. Who would you give that to?
Oh my God, I completely forgot about this question. I did this last time, and then I'm thinking on the spot. I would say, oh man, that is such a tough one. You know what? The thing that's really, really challenging is that there's so many individuals that you want to support them in their journey, but they are not open to that journey. And so if you were to give a copy to someone, are they actually going to read that book? And that's where sometimes that orange pill, who would you orange pill? I think that I'm just going to go like straight to the top and maybe just go, I'm going to go Klaus Schwab. If you can orange pill Klaus Schwab, see if completely changes our theory. Because honestly, I do believe that there's not 1,000 people that are all trying to push this wild agenda at this big cabal. I do believe when you start digging into these situations, these totalitarian environments, and I talk about this in the book actually, is that many times a lot of the people that are in power today are in power because they have been subservient to the person above them. They've been subservient to the person above them. The people that actually stand out and want to create change, they don't go into politics. And they just go and start their own business and try and create change that way. And so because of that, you have a lot of these people in power that basically it's not their beliefs. There's people behind them, and those beliefs are showing through those individuals. So it makes it seem like there's this big ruling class. And in the reality, I think that there are a handful of individuals that have certain beliefs that are now percolating down through leaders globally. And one of those crews of people is the World Economic Forum. You start to see where if you just look at, what is it called? The Build Back Better regime. The Build Back Better, you've seen it by Biden, you've seen it in the UK, you've seen it in Canada, you've seen it in Australia, you've seen it in New Zealand, you've seen it all over the world. And this is not their voice. It's World Economic Forum voice. And so if you're able to get to the root, which obviously as Bitcoiners, we always talk about getting to the root of the issue rather than just trying to treat the symptom. I think that many times these symptoms, whether it is Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand or Trudeau or Biden, these are just symptoms of an underlying root. And I think that root, a big part of that root is the World Economic Forum. So I would go with this orange pill, Mr. Klaus Schwab, and get him on board.
Hopefully, mate. Hopefully. Oh, God. Yeah. Ugh, they give me the shivers, those freaks. They are.
Oh my God.
I mean,
It's, I'll
Arden in
mention something
particular.
interesting. Oh, totally. I'll mention something interesting, which is I have this belief that I don't think there's people, and I could be totally wrong here. It's just my belief. I have this belief that people are not inherently malicious or evil. I think people are a product of their environment. And when you start looking at, let's just say, British politicians, most British politicians have been sent off to boarding school at such a young age. So
Yeah.
they haven't felt loved by their parents. They haven't felt supported by their parents. And so many times they've got all of these emotional abandonment wounds. So when they find themselves in positions of power, they're simply acting out the trauma which they felt to the child that they were not supported with. And so it's my belief that many of these people that want to kind of control, many of these people that want to kind of govern over the masses, they're simply acting out childhood trauma. And I think it's really important to recognize this, because sometimes we banish certain people, or we think certain people are evil. We look at even, say, the prison system and all of these individuals. How could you do such heinous acts? But many times, all they're responding to is trauma, and these are coping mechanisms. And so, if you're able to fix our society on a root level, if you're able to give parents more time to support parents in nurturing their children, I would be willing to bet that you would actually see less of these controlling structures over time, given that people have more compassion, people have more empathy, people actually grow up understanding who they are and and understanding what their authentic needs are.
Mate, I've come to the same conclusion. Because you look at them again, British politicians in particular. I mean, first of all, what a freaking clown show just watching them argue with each other in the House of Commons is. It's like, what are you doing? You're all yelling across the bench at each other like kids, quite frankly. It's like watching a bunch of kids. And you're right, they get shipped off to boarding schools a very young age, complete abandonment, very, very young. They have no idea why. They're forced to act in certain ways. They're force-fed information down their necks. Some of them are groomed for positions through family ties or whatever else. And you see that, yeah, you see that play out, and they get like this kind of God complex thing going on as well. And then when Johnson was, and this is where it gets, I'm gonna take this, swing the pendulum back to the dark side here. When Johnson was prime minister, I came to that conclusion like you. I'm like, this is just a kid that he even acts like a child. He dresses like a child. He cannot, like, he can't even comb his hair. This is absolutely retarded. I'm like, well, what was the father doing? And you're like, what was his story? And he's an author. He's written a lot of books. The best-selling book he's ever written is called The Marburg Virus. You're like, what? And that was re-released as The Virus during the pandemic. I'm like, this is absolutely, like, this is nuts. This cannot be. Then I just started looking into the other titles of the books that he's written. He's written a lot of fiction, but then the non-fiction stuff, The Politics of Population, The Population Problem, World Population Turning the Tide, World Population and the United Nations, Earth Summit, the United Nations. That's too small. The Politics of the Environment. I'm like, holy shit. We've got the son, an abandoned son of a person, a father that has written books for United Nations about world population control at the helm of a country during a pandemic, which was clear for us all to see. That's when shit gets weird, man. That's when you get goosebumps. And I can't put a finger on exactly what is going on way behind the scenes. But yes, the WEF. You've even had Schwab on stage, right? Talking about we have infiltrated the cabinets, like that classic lecture he gave at or interview he gave at Harvard. And then when you saw Trudeau's actions, then you saw Arden's actions and Johnson's, they were all young global leaders, weren't they, from the WEF program? Goodness me, mate.
Well, and they even just tell you straight up, like many people may have listened to, I think it was in 2014 or 2015, Bill Gates did a TED talk. And it's one of the most listened to TED talks, I believe. And he even mentions they're just like, we need to get the population down.
Yeah.
And he says, we're going to do that through the shot. And it's just like, did you just say that? Like, you're telling everyone.
It's amazing, man. Truly is amazing. All right, so the orange pill, ram it down Schwab's neck. Let's get the world righted again, because we live in an inverted clown world. Where can people reach out to you, mate, and learn more about you and interact and invite you along to speaking events or whatever? What's the best way to get in touch?
So you can find me just on Twitter at SebBunny, and Bunny is Bunney. You can also, I've got a website, sebbunny.com, and I talk a lot about this in my newsletter called The Chi of Self-Sovereignty, where I was just talking about how do we be more sovereign? How do we allow ourselves to show up more authentically in this world? And then finally, I've co-founded a platform with Daz and Greg Foss and a few others called Looking Glass Education. And that's all about just free financial literacy education, macroeconomic education, Bitcoin education for the layperson, because I think more and more we need content for the average individual so they understand what is happening. And that's ultimately the hidden cost of money was my goal at that. I wanted to try and create a book that just kind of broke down our monetary system from a holistic viewpoint into a single resource without being too confronting when it comes to Bitcoin. So you don't actually touch on Bitcoin until the very, very end, just like Price of Tomorrow took a page out of Jeff's book.
Exactly. Perfect. And thank you for hosting my articles as well, the two I've written on Looking Glass. I appreciate that.
Oh, honestly, it's the least I can do. I completely blanked on mentioning. I think the Ursary one was unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. And I think it never ceases to amaze me how people don't question that when you go and borrow money from a bank, they're the ones who are setting the terms, yet they are also the ones that are just simply printing this money out of thin air and benefiting from this. And when you start digging into the monetary system, it really makes you look at the world very differently. And so you're a huge, huge part of that, and you've made a huge influence on me. And so I truly appreciate it. It means a lot, Princey.
Mate, thank you very much for coming on. Thanks for the kind words. Thanks for all of the work that you're doing in Bitcoin. Next year is going to be a huge one for all of us, yourself particularly. Ride the wave and get ready to write a new book, I suppose, in 2025.
I'm definitely taking a break from writing for a bit. I love the act of writing, but I dropped out of English when I was 12 years old. So I feel like I write in a very conversational tone. And if anyone notices any spelling mistakes in the book, it's been edited many times, but you can never trust my spelling.
Let's get one shipped off to your old English teacher if he or she is still around.
I don't even know what their name is.
Right.
I've got so much trouble.
All right, man. Take care. Great to see you again.
Thanks.